So let's begin with looking at dementia in the arts and in literature. Historically, the words that we've used to describe dementia have been very different over the years, right through from words like amentia to imbecility, describing somebody as an imbecile. That was never used in the past as an insult the way it is today. We use that in English as an insult for somebody, and hopefully we don't use that word, but it used to be used as simply a description of somebody whose mental capacities were not all that great. And there are other words that you've got up there: morosis, fatuitis, annoia, foolishness, stupidity, simplicity, charis, idiocy, dotage, and senility. Again, senility was a word that used to be simply describing old age even, but now we regard it as being somebody who has dementia, or whose mental faculties are failing them. So there's been a remarkable variety of ways that we use to describe dementia. For those of you who have grown up in other countries, how is dementia understood there? I know we had a discussion yesterday about the fact that in some cultures there's not a lot of people with dementia. But how is it understood in various cultures?
I think in our country, like as I said yesterday, there was no word of dementia, but no aged care. But if, like, they lost their memory and they showing the unusual behaviors, they categorize under like mental illness. Like they will just, like, some people I have seen, like our elder people, like in relatives, they playing with the feces and stuff, like and they will say, okay, it's
mental illness.
Mental illness, yeah.
Okay.
But I didn't heard of dementia. We know, like, when they get older, like they lose their memory and they forget the things. So we accept that it's like normal aging. But if they show the unusual behavior, antisocial behavior and those sort of things, they don't categorize under dementia or anything. They just say, okay, like mental illness, it's signs of mental illness.
Okay.
Some they do the treatment, some they doesn't do. They accept as like, okay, this is part of aging, and they're doing this sort of things. But there is not much treatment there for that. Yeah. Yes.
Good.
But I was not aware of dementia. Once I came here and I found, like, this many people here in aged care, like every single person, like they got like dementia, short-term memory loss. Even I have got my grandfather. He is like 88 or 89. So when I'm talking to him over the phone, sometimes he doesn't recognize me very well, but still he's doing his things by himself. So now I can see there is a little bit of dementia. So, but yeah.
Okay, but it was not recognised.
No, it doesn't recognize.
In Nepalese culture.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And in Vietnam?
Well, dementia is recognized in Vietnam, but I don't think there's a lot of education organization mentioned about dementia. It's like very small number of people, like especially in big cities, about dementia only. But then in terms of management and like management of behaviors and how to support the elderly with dementia, it's not well educated.
Okay.
In Vietnam.
Good. Thanks, Rhoda.
I learned Chinese medicine for a while, and from my knowledge, there's something being done for the confusion. People become confused. I mean, the term dementia is not really clear there before, and sometimes the confusion is because it's second to vascular disease after stroke or something short term maybe, but sometimes it's just like progress and getting worse, and so in this case people not really do anything, but early stage they try to do something like, because they thought it's caused by something else. It's because of vascular disease, and they can do something.
Okay.
Because in China, medication is caused by the flying or something like the weakness of qi or something. They try to do something. But if people reach certain age, they're out, they say it's normal process, just like, oh, he's old enough, he's confused, or something like that.
So it's just regarded as a normal part of aging or a weakness in the qi.
Yeah. But if people have this problem onset early, and then families do try to seek treatment for them.
Yeah.
But without, they don't really. Just the symptoms like care family, just like, oh, he needs somebody or she needs somebody care all the time for ideals or something.
All right. Thanks, Linda. In Zimbabwe?
No, in Zimbabwe, I haven't seen those cases. Yeah. What I can only relate to is the memory loss, but that is also in a very few percentage. It's a very low percentage of memory loss. But as to having those signs of dementia itself, like confusion and all those other behaviors, I really myself, I haven't seen that. I've been a nurse in Zimbabwe like for 14 years before I came over here.
Right.
But in the hospitals that I went, I've never seen, or even in the community that I was brought up, I've never seen it.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's interesting how differently it's experienced around the world. Yeah. Caroline? Same? Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And in Netherlands?
Same as here.
Yeah. So it's well recognised as a particular disease.
Yeah, and I guess with Alzheimer being the German next to the Dutch, I think we got onto it pretty quick as well.
Yeah.
So he know better than me, I don't know.
Yeah. So it is very different around the world, and it's also different through history. As you can see here, all of the different terms, and I'm sure each of our countries would have a different term for it. Sometimes it was viewed as a form of madness, sometimes viewed as possession by an evil spirit, sometimes a weakness of the qi, a failure of moral integrity. If a person was weak in their ability to continue their normal function, then it was often seen as a defect of the intellect and judgment. Here, back in the 17th century, stupidity and foolishness. This, any changes in behaviour in old age were often seen as a failure of the person's moral qualities, as well as their intellectual qualities. Dementia, the word, is regarded as simply being out of one's mind or without mind. So this is a taking of the Latin terms for thinking or of mind, mentia.
In those days, like, I guess people wouldn't live that long, so...
I was just going to say that, life expectancy would vary between various countries in the world.
That's right.
Yeah.
So if your life expectancy in Zimbabwe is only 70, whereas in the Western world it might be 80, nearly 90, then you can have cases of dementia.
That's right.
Anyway.
Generally, back in the 17th century, people would have died of many other illnesses. And at the same time, though, there were situations where people would live into their 70s, but they weren't great in number. And they were regarded as being, or if they showed some of these signs, and sometimes those signs would have been due to what we regard as a delirium now, some sort of curable medical condition, but which in those days they might not have had a cure for. So in the process of those delirium conditions, they would have exhibited many of the symptoms that are similar to what we would regard as dementia today. So we didn't regard it as a disease so much until the 20th century, when Alzheimer was able to identify those, as we saw yesterday, those slides, able to identify the plaques and tangles, and also benefit from the work in the 19th century of developing systematic approaches to classifying diseases. And that only happened in the 18th, 19th century, when there was a gradual classification. So it's taken about 200 years of developing our thinking to develop these classification systems that we have today. And that helps us to understand things as diseases. Now, at the same time, there's the development of microscopes. So that helps us to identify a lot more of the processes underneath. Let me see, that's not going to work until I put the machining. No, it's okay. I've got it. I just needed to plug it in. Now it'll work. Beautiful. In medieval times, there was a view of memory as an art. Memory was something that you cultivated, that you were able to develop over time. And this was a really new way of looking at mental function. And this is important for us because it developed gradually through the work of Aristotle, with the Greeks, with Galen, and finally in the Enlightenment, understanding that a well-trained memory is a sign of moral quality or of virtue. So you were living a much better life if your memory was developed, if you were cultivating your intellectual capacities. Okay, so this is a very different way to view a human life. So we're valuing memory as an art. So the art of memory is not only remembering, but learning, ruminating on things. And mostly in those days, the only, well not the only, but the dominant literature that was around were the scriptures. It was the Bible in Christian Europe at that stage, where a lot of this developed. So there was a sense of ruminating or chewing it over, which was the process they used with a lot of the scriptures in those days. So what we see is the process of learning or remembering was done not just by sitting still, but in fact walking around, murmuring, repeating things to yourself, all of which we understand today as some of the memory techniques that will in fact enhance your memory. So these people had hit upon a lot of the techniques, not through any particularly scientific approach, but through astute observation, that this was the way to improve your memory. And so what they would do is they would talk, they would walk, they would murmur to themselves, they would eat or drink while reading, and oddly enough, they would sometimes rub herbs into their head as a way to promote their learning. So, who knows? But the idea was that the goodness from the herbs, which were regarded as primary forms of medicine, would enhance your learning capacity. There was a lot of these beliefs supported the understanding of learning and memory. Remembering, sorry?
So it would be just be interesting to know what kind of the specific herbs. There's a lot of things like that
It would be, yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of folk medicine associated with it, but there will be particularly, there are some herbs associated with memory. Rosemary is one that's supposed to enhance memory. Memory or remembering was seen as an imaginative art, a way of living that requires good health, discipline of mind and of action. So there's a moral quality here. So living a good life is being disciplined, but being creative as well and looking after your health. Now that's all very well if you've got the means to do it, but most people in the Middle Ages didn't have the means to do these sorts of things. Here's a statement by a chap in 1235. This is going right back in history. So you can read it there in your handouts. I'll read it for you. This was a chap who was a teacher at the University of Bologna in 1235. Let the intellect, or the animus, of him who wishes to remember, rejoice, because rejoicing much strengthens the ability to remember. Let him who is going to remember enjoy the freedom he has longed for, because the constraint of one's will does great harm. Let him enjoy fresh, free air, because the container changes the contained. Let the diet be tempered according to the nature of the person's complexion, and let it be eaten in moderation. Stop now and then in delightful and pleasant spots in which one may hear nightingales and the sweet sound of running of brooks. So there you have a fairly, what we would regard today as a fairly romanticised view of how the memory functions and what's going to benefit your intellect. But in fact they paint a really lovely picture of how to have a good life. And so dementia is what is going to run counter to that. Dementia is not doing that. Dementia is going to be the undoing of a lot of these good things, this good remembering that you're able to do, and to use that art of memory is undone in dementia. In the Enlightenment, there was what's called a rational individualism applied. And so that means simply there was a focus on the person or the individual human being identified much more strongly than they were in the past. So memory became a mechanical process of imprinting that's less valuable than reason. So reasoning or rationality became prized as the primary mark of humanity. This is the thing we as human beings can do, is to be able to reason, to think things through. So memory was much less valued when the Enlightenment came on, whereas in previous years, the medieval times, then memory was much more to the fore.
But also, back in the Middle Ages, there weren't many books, but by this time they had a bit more printing around, so they didn't have to remember as much.
That's right, yes. So it was much less oral history, reliant on memory, and there was much more printing around. You're absolutely right. So we see a different emphasis, if you like, on what's important in human functioning over history. It moves from a view of it being a soulful moral activity to a soulless mechanical process. In other words, when I'm thinking, I'm going through a mechanical process. It's almost like there are cogs whirring in my head, in my skull. But interestingly, there's also a development of machinery happening. So what we see is the metaphor for intellectual processing and human functioning becomes taking on the metaphor for the machinery around us. And interestingly, that's what's happened today, because the metaphor we use is that of a computer. So we talk about memory in terms of encoding, saving or storing, and then retrieving. So we're using a computer metaphor to understand our memory, the same way that in history they used the metaphors of their own day, of machinery or of spirits and soulfulness, etc., that would have inhabited the human mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Medical diagnostic systems were gradually developing in this period of the Enlightenment away from Galen's ideas, because Galen was a doctor Greek who first developed the idea of there being humours or spirits that caused various illnesses. And so there were initially, I think there were 4 basic personality types. Does anyone know them? There was the phlegmatic type, the choleric type, I can't remember the others now, the melancholic type, and there was a bodily part associated with these various humours. Okay. But as medical diagnoses and medical knowledge develops, we move away from Galen's idea, and you can look up all of these characters. If you do an internet search, I'm sure you can find some information on Galen very quickly. Interesting character. As we move away from Galen's ideas of humours that must be kept in balance, we move to a much more disease-focused approach to medical health or to human health. And so diseases become more identifiable, and they develop lists of symptoms of diseases. So we end up with a classification system. But that classification system is developed on the basis of various philosophies. Now, philosophy is simply a set of ideas that help us to understand reality. But there was a chap by the name of John Locke, who is an important figure here in history as a philosopher who had a view of the human person that's important for us to understand here. Personhood is about continuous identity, and memory shouldn't change. So your sense of who you are as a person is continuous regardless of what your memory does. But this is important for us because he's gradually teasing out what makes you a human person. The personhood is dependent on being able to remember. So memory shouldn't change. A good memory gives structure to successful identity. And so here we find a very basic idea that underpins a lot of the way that commonly humanity is seen. Because you look at the way a lot of staff approach people with dementia, and many people in the community. So gradually, if you lose your memory, your ability to remember who you are and remember things about your life, then you lose who you are. And this is what John Locke is getting at. Good memory gives structure to successful identity. But if you lose your memory, you lose your identity. That's the idea. Personhood becomes associated with intact memory. Now, this is important for us because it underpins a lot of the way that people see the human person these days. In the person-centred approach, we actually see it slightly differently. That in fact, personhood is not dependent upon being able to remember. So we want to move away from John Locke's idea. Because if you think about it, all of the people you care for, according to John Locke, are no longer individuals with an identity. But we would say, in fact, if we're using the person-centred approach, that this person has their own identity still. They are a unique person. They retain their personhood, regardless of how much disability they have. Okay, so let's move on. In the 18th century, a physical dictionary was developed by Blanchard, who talked about the extinction of the imagination and judgment. So they're much more specific now. They're trying to identify particular abilities, judgment, imagination. And the use of the word demens to describe being without mind starts to come into more popular use. When memory goes, so too does personal identity. Again, we're still seeing the effects of Locke and his work into the 19th century, into the 18th century. But in the 19th century, this is the 1800s, hospital care and nursing care is developed. So we start to see the rise of a much more medicalised view of health. Institutional care for people whose behaviour is not socially acceptable starts to become much more common. So we get a lot of the asylums, what were commonly called lunatic asylums, developed. And in Australia, in the 19th century, Australia was developing as a country with a lot of the white settlement developing. And that had coincided with the development of a lot of these institutions in Europe, which flowed over to Australia. And so historically, we find that as Australia developed its health systems, it borrowed from Europe, and we got large red brick health institutions, what were called asylums in those days, homes for the insane. And people with dementia were housed along with people who had been chronically mentally ill for most of their lives. And we find that in many of the large psychiatric institutions, that people with dementia, having lived a full, profitable, healthy life, now at this period of time in their dementia are included among the mentally insane. The disease model underpins the development of diagnostic criteria sets. So we have a list of symptoms that help us to diagnose particular illnesses. And alongside that is the development of microscopes. Now, ironically, or interestingly I should say, the development of microscopes is something that enables us to identify bacteria, viruses, to be able to develop the use of stains for slides so that we can identify cells. And all of this helps to identify and confirm the disease model of human health. So in the 20th century, Alzheimer comes along and builds on that knowledge by identifying the plaques and tangles that we now associate with Alzheimer's disease. So it's regarded as a particular medical condition, and other medical discoveries support this. We now have antibiotics, we have x-rays, we have brain scans, we now have electron microscopes that can identify down to extraordinary levels the reality that we live with. And still, John Locke's approach that identity and personhood are to be found in brain function, and that identity of personhood and memory are associated, then brain function is where we will find identity. So when brain function changes, identity changes. So we have this link still associated due to the work of John Locke and others in that time. Memory is lost, then personhood is lost. And the person becomes depersonalised. So if you regard the person as no longer present, then you can do all sorts of things to them. You don't have to treat them with the respect that you would accord somebody whose personhood is still present. And so people with dementia are treated in ways that are no longer respectful. They can be overpowered. They can be made to live in conditions that you wouldn't normally allow human beings to live in, etc. They can be denied choice because they can't make choices for themselves, so why would you bother asking them? This is the mind that goes with this approach. If they've lost their identity, then you can treat them as less than human, which is what happens. Now, a lot of this is not explicit, it's not stated explicitly, but sometimes it actually is in the literature. It's very interesting to see it happen. And so people are isolated, they're often shunted to these lunatic asylums, and they are treated in ways that are full of stigma, and so they're hidden away in families. Families will deny that somebody has dementia, or they'll lock them in their rooms. Mind you, there was no social support to enable families to cope well, and so often it would be a child would end up looking after the grandparent while the parents went out onto the farm to do the work. And so, or they were locked up during the day. And so this dementia was regarded as a form of madness, and so there was a lot of fear associated with it, and there was a controlled management approach taken to it. But there were no supports around to enable families to cope, and people would keep the person hidden away. In the 20th century, we have the development of client-centered psychotherapy, which was very quickly adopted as the standard existential philosophy that we see today in many approaches to healthcare. It underpins a lot of healthcare, from patient-centered nursing through to the disability services and now into modern aged care, particularly in the Western world, but also in many places in Asia. In Japan, the person-centered approach is affecting a lot of their healthcare. In Hong Kong, I know there is quite a move to develop the person-centered approach in healthcare as well. And in Singapore, in Korea, and in India, I know of those countries, and I'm sure there are other areas where the person-centered philosophy underpins the modern healthcare approach. But they're just some of the countries I'm particularly familiar with. Nursing and disability services adopt an approach called the patient-centred nursing approach, and so I'm sure all of you have been educated in that sort of approach in your nursing, and an approach of person-centred care for people with intellectual disability. Now, intellectual disability services have used the person-centred philosophy for many decades, and only recently has aged care come to approach to use the person-centred philosophy. And dementia care now uses this approach from about the mid-80s in the UK and the US, where it had started to influence discussion and conferences and so on. And now it really is taking off to a high degree in most developing nations or developed nations.
It took a while for Australia to catch up, didn't it?
Yeah, very
20
much.
years.
Yeah, we've had a very predominantly medicalised model of aged care, and particularly dementia care.
When I started in aged care, that's only, 8 years ago, we were still training everybody to the gym.
Wow.
Wow.
How long ago was that?
That was when I started here, in 2005.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
It's not long.
Yeah.
Not long ago. There have been some quite specific policies about things like that have caused people to have to move away from it. So even though there was a push towards a more person-centred philosophy, there were still the old practices hanging on, like restraint and overuse of psychotropic medication. Now, even still, because of the push from at a policy level, it's starting to take place. But there is still quite an overuse of psychotropics.
And I suppose it's one thing to change policies and the way we do things, but to really change the attitudes and ideas behind it.
Yeah.
Maybe after a long time.
Yeah, very difficult. And I'm sure among your colleagues you will find a whole range of approaches that cover all of the different positions we've talked about here. So what we're doing here with this survey, it's running through all of these different approaches, is to help you be clear in your thinking about where you might see this in your colleagues. Where do you see it in the way that people approach things? You know? So just have a think about that as we go along here, and how that influences the choices they make about what's important in their work. Because if you view the person as not having any more identity because their mind has gone, or because they've lost a lot of their memory, therefore they don't have personhood, therefore they don't have identity. Therefore, I can tie them to a chair, or I can make them do things without asking them. I can have a task-focused approach and not interact warmly with them, because it's not important. Does that make sense? Whereas if you regard the person as still being present, then you can't do that, if you have a conscience. Okay, so bearing all of that in mind, in our 21st century, let's read this little piece from Stephen Katz. Reducing people to their brains and isolating them as sick and marginal in the name of cognitive care harms memory, which is continual even when forgetful. Memory is emotional as well as cerebral, because our brains are centres of feeling as well as cognition or thinking. To separate the two means failing to understand memory as an art as well as science. So here Stephen Katz is starting to help us to think differently about a modern approach to understanding the human person. And there's another person who I haven't written about here, but who I've read about since I developed the slides, and it's a lady by the name of Pia Kontos. And she talks about the person being embodied. She talks about embodied personhood. So that even though we might have lost our memory, even though we might have lost our ability to problem solve and to think, we are still an embodied person. I'm still in my body. And my body will still express me. Yeah? Because even the very fact of me reaching out to take this cup is an expression of my desire, of my want for a drink. Now that's my body expressing me in some way. Yeah? My body making eye contact with you is an expression of my social need for connection. So my body is constantly expressing who I am. Even though I might not be able to put it into words, or solve problems, or find my way to the toilet, or eat independently, I'm still expressing myself in what my body does. Okay? So this is another way to think about personhood. Because Kontos is saying, personhood remains as long as there is life.
But what about, like, you know, there are people who say, you know, people stuck in bed all night, they don't move, they don't talk, they don't blink, they don't do anything to feedback to sort of thing had on.
Well, yes, even the what you might describe as the locked-in syndrome, you know, where somebody has had a massive stroke, and I don't know if you ever read that book about the butterfly and the diving bell.
Watch the movie.
Yeah, fascinating. I've watched the movie recently. It's extraordinary. Where the only thing that the person could do was blink, and he wrote a book, blinking. And he lived for 6 years, some period of time. And once they realised that in fact this person was still functioning even though he was locked in.
But he had a good brain though.
Yeah, he had total brain capacity, yeah.
I don't know, I couldn't see
A bit like
what
the woman on the counter.
So,
I was reading an article recently of a woman who was they thought she was fully in a coma. It was actually her friends who realised that she was blinking and could move. They started communicating. It took them a few days, and then they took that information to the doctors, and it made a world of difference. They were then able to treat her.
Yeah. I guess, James, what you're referring to is where the person
End-stage dementia.
Yeah, in end-stage dementia. The body is still expressing personhood. Maybe not in the social ways that you and I are used to accepting. In other words, there might not be eye contact. But what you've still got is often reflexes. You know, the grasp reflex.
It's the reflex, it's not a...
But is it any less valuable than anything else?
And do we know if it's reflex or a...
Involuntary.
Yeah.
Well, what is important to an infant is to grasp. Yeah. So the meaningfulness of the action is in the eye of the beholder often. So our personhood is often carried by the people around us, even though our bodies might not be able to express it all that well or easily. So this notion of embodied personhood is that the person carries and expresses their personhood through their body, even in their final stages. So it's an interesting notion that will help us to think differently about the people that we care for and to value the small communications that somebody in a chair, unable to verbally communicate, is having with us.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about what James has just been saying. To say even if someone is in that vegetative stage, that the personhood, I think, is still there, as you have said, to say it's still connected. That person still has got people who he has impacted, so that personhood is still there through other people as well.
Yeah.
Even though we as nursing staff maybe we're not really impacted in one way or the other, or maybe we have been, let's say maybe for a resident who we have been caring for a long time, they deteriorate, we are still connected to that person. So that person would still it's still there. We can't touch it, but really in the spirit, we are still connected to that person. So we have to value that person as well.
Yeah.
And we have to be like ambassadors to represent that person. He cannot say, please tell me, but me as the ambassador, I should say, oh, I think this is high time I should tell Libai, because I still value the person more.
Yeah. So there's an interconnectedness there that is very different to historically how we have seen the human person. If you think back to John Locke, he saw the human person as identified with your mental capacities. If you can think and remember, then you are a human person. But if you can't think and can't remember, then you don't have the personhood that we would normally associate with humanity. And that has affected the way we have viewed people with intellectual disability all the way through to people with dementia. Yeah.
I mean, you used to hear a lot of nurses say, oh, well, you know, that person, the lights are on, but no one's home.
Yeah, you can make comments like that
That used to say
when you have this view. Yeah. But in fact, what we would say is, the lights might not be on, but somebody's still home. If you want to use that sort of a metaphor.
So I wonder what someone like John Locke would have thought of young children,
That's what I was going to say, yeah.
like 2-year-olds.
Yeah.
People till they reach a certain age, yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you say that, yeah. When you look at art, the way they depicted young children was as adults, small adults.
Yes.
Yeah, they were often dressed as mature adults, or
Even if you look back 100 years ago, photos, young people look old straight away to that's quite often, you know.
yeah.
But even that old
Interesting.
expression of, was it children are to be seen and not heard? You think about how education is changing even more so much now, in the way we teach kids. I don't know, there's some correlation somewhere in my head between sometimes how we treat children
Sure.
and how we treat people.
Very much. Yeah, we infantilise people a lot.